Her alpha man slapped me in front of my wife and kids and claimed the house was his. How did everything I believed about my life unravel in a single moment? My best friend betrayed me, my wife took his side, and suddenly the world I'd worked so hard to build was in ashes. But what I did next? You won't believe the twists, the shocking revelations, and the ultimate payback that left everyone speechless. Stay tuned, because the ending will leave you stunned. I always thought I had a handle on my life. I wasn't one to chase dreams of luxury or glamour. I never cared for flashy cars or the big house on the hill. No, what I wanted was simple. I had a steady job in it, a warm home to come back to every night, and a family that meant everything to me. Isabel, my wife, and I had been together for 14 years. Mason, our 12-year-old son, was the kind of kid who always asked too many questions, curious about everything. Ava, our 9-year-old daughter, loved to draw on just about any surface she could find. It wasn't perfect, sure, but it was ours. I worked long hours sometimes, but that was okay, because at the end of the day, I'd come home to the people I loved. I didn't think I needed anything more, but lately, something had been gnawing at me. Isabel had always been the organized one, the planner. Her job in marketing kept her busy, but we'd made it work for over a decade. Recently, though, she started coming home later than usual. At first, I didn't think much of it. She'd earned a promotion a few months ago, and I knew her workload had doubled. But then there were the little things, small shifts in her behavior, that I couldn't ignore. She'd laugh at something on her phone, and refuse to show me the message. She'd talk about her boss, Liam Bennett, as though he were some kind of genius, someone who truly understood her work. I tried brushing it off. I mean, work relationships can be close without crossing any lines, right? She'd always been honest with me. At least, I thought she had. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I'm not the type to snoop, I believe in privacy, but this time, something in my gut told me to look. I reached over and saw a preview of a text. Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again tonight. My heart sank. I just stared at the screen, my chest tightening as the pieces started to fall into place. Her late nights at the office, the hushed laughter at her phone, the sudden distance between us, everything I'd been trying to ignore was right there, laid bare in a single message. When she came out of the bathroom, her hair wrapped in a towel, I couldn't hold it in. Isabel, care to explain this? I asked, my voice low but trembling. She froze, her eyes darting to the screen. For a moment, she looked like a kid caught with their hand in the cookie jar. But then she scoffed. Jesus, Cameron, are you seriously going through my messages now? She said, her tone sharp, dismissive. That's all you have to say? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I ask you a direct question, and you're more worried about me seeing your texts than what's actually in them. She ran a hand through her damp hair and shrugged, trying to brush it off. You're blowing this out of proportion. It's nothing. Last night was incredible, I said, my voice cracking with anger. That's nothing? It's not what you think, she replied, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. I just stood there, staring at her, waiting for her to say something, anything that would make sense of the message. But she said nothing. Instead, she rolled her eyes, grabbed her phone, and walked past me as if the conversation was over. And maybe, in her mind, it was. But for me, it was just the beginning. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the text in my head, over and over, until it felt like it was burned into my memory. Last night was incredible. The words felt like a punch to the gut every time I thought about them. She'd lied to me. She'd lied about late nights at work, about being too tired to talk, about everything. And the worst part? I didn't even know how long it had been going on. The next morning, I got up and tried to act normal for the kids. Mason and Ava didn't need to know what was happening, at least, not yet. Mason was sharp though. He picked up on the tension right away. Dad, why does Mom always talk about Liam? He asked over breakfast. His voice casual but his eyes full of questions. He's just her boss, I replied, trying to sound as normal as possible. But Mason wasn't convinced. She talks about him more than she talks about you, he said, his words cutting deeper than he could have known. I forced a smile and ruffled his hair. She works with him a lot, buddy, I said. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't enough. I spent the rest of the day at work, my mind barely registering what I was doing. I went through the motions, but my thoughts were stuck on that text, on Isabel, on Liam Bennett. The name alone was enough to make my chest tighten. How long had this been going on? What had I missed? I couldn't focus on anything else. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a jolt of anxiety. Every time someone mentioned their weekend plans or their spouse, I felt a pang of jealousy, a reminder that my own marriage was crumbling before my eyes. By the time I got home, I was a mess. Isabel wasn't there another late night at work. I sat on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching. Mason and Ava were upstairs, playing quietly in their rooms, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing downstairs. I couldn't bring myself to look at them. How could I face them, knowing that their world was about to be turned upside down? Eventually, I heard Isabel's car pull into the driveway. The sound of the engine cutting off, the familiar jingle of her keys as she unlocked the front door, it all felt so normal. Yet it wasn't. She walked in, her face calm, as if nothing had happened. "Long day?" she asked. Her tone light, almost cheerful. I stared at her, my mouth dry, unsure of what to say. She breezed past me, setting her bag down on the counter, and started talking about work, about meetings, about things that no longer felt real to me. I knew I had to confront her again, but the words wouldn't come. I felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into a void. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a bad day or a rough patch. This was the end of everything I thought I knew. And the worst part? It wasn't even a sudden realization. It was a slow, creeping certainty that had been building for weeks, months even. I'd been ignoring the signs, telling myself that we were fine, that we'd get through it. But now, as I sat there watching her move around the kitchen like nothing was wrong, I knew the truth. Our marriage was already over. I just hadn't admitted it yet. The turning point came one unassuming Thursday evening. I got home earlier than usual. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange hue through the kitchen windows. Normally, Isabel would have been making dinner or helping Mason with his homework. But the house was unusually quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional chirp of a bird outside. But that was it. Mason and Ava were upstairs, their doors shut, and Isabel wasn't home. She'd said she'd be late again because of a last-minute meeting. I tried to ignore the tightening in my chest, tried to convince myself that maybe she really was caught up at work. I set my briefcase down by the door and went to pour myself a glass of water. As I stood there, staring at the kitchen counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I thought about the message I'd seen on her phone the night before. The words flashed in my mind like a neon sign. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again tonight." Tonight. That's what it said. She was with him, Liam, tonight. My stomach twisted, but I shook it off. No, not yet. I needed more than that one text. I needed proof. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I found myself reaching for her laptop. It was sitting on the counter, closed but not locked. Isabel wasn't one to password protect everything. She always said it was too much trouble. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a twinge of guilt, but then I thought about the text again, about the way she had brushed me off. My hands moved on their own. I flipped it open, the screen glowing to life. Her email was still logged in. I told myself I wouldn't dig too deep, just a quick look to confirm what I already suspected. But as I scrolled through her inbox, I saw it, a string of messages from Liam Bennett, each one more damning than the last. "You looked amazing in that dress today. I can't stop thinking about our last trip. Let's do it again soon." My jaw clenched as I read them. She had been lying to me for months. Every late night meeting, every work trip she had been with him. My heart pounded in my chest as I kept scrolling. The dates, the times, they matched up perfectly. All the nights she said she was too tired. All the weekends she said she had client events. I felt my face flush hot with anger and shame. I had been so blind. I heard the garage door open. She was home. I closed the laptop quickly, my hands shaking, and tried to compose myself. She walked in, smiling as if nothing had happened. She had a bag of takeout in one hand, and her purse in the other. "Hey," she said casually, setting the food down on the counter. I didn't respond at first. I just stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, staring at her. She must have noticed something in my expression because her smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Where were you?" I said, my tone sharper than I intended. She blinked, caught off guard. "At the office. I told you I'd be late." "The office," I repeated, my voice low. "With Liam Bennett." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence stretching between us. "Cameron," the first she began, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said, "just don't." "I saw the messages, Isabel." "I know." Her face turned pale. She didn't even bother denying it. Instead, she straightened up, her expression hardening. "So what?" she said, her tone defiant. "What do you mean, so what?" I shouted, my voice echoing off the kitchen walls. "You've been sneaking around behind my back. You've been lying to me, to our kids. What the hell is wrong with you? Don't you dare turn this on me," she snapped. "You don't know what it's like, Cameron. You're never around. You're always working, always distracted. You don't listen to me. You don't care about what I want. I've been working to provide for this family," I yelled. "I've been busting my ass so you and the kids could have a good life. And this is how you repay me?" She crossed her arms, her jaw set. "You're acting like a child. Grow up, Cameron." I stared at her, my chest heaving. I didn't even recognize the woman standing in front of me. I thought I knew her. Thought I could trust her. But now I realized I didn't know her at all. Just then, Mason appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "Mom? Dad? Why are you yelling?" he asked, his voice small, his eyes wide. Isabel and I both froze, turning to look at him. "It's nothing, buddy," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Go back upstairs." "No," he said, his voice trembling. "Why are you fighting?" Isabel shot me a look, silently pleading for me to keep quiet. But I couldn't, not anymore. "Mason," I said, kneeling down so I was at his eye level. "Sometimes grown-ups don't agree on things. But it's nothing for you to worry about. Okay?" He looked at me for a long moment, then at his mother. "Is it because of Liam?" he asked. Isabel's face went white. "What?" she stammered. "What did you say?" Mason frowned. "You talk about him all the time." "I thought maybe." "Mason, go upstairs," Isabel said sharply. He hesitated, glancing between us, then slowly turned and went back to his room. As soon as he was out of earshot, Isabel turned on me. "How dare you bring him into this?" she hissed. "How dare I?" I shot back. "You're the one who brought Liam into our lives. You're the one who's been sneaking around, lying to all of us. Don't you dare try to put this on me." She looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the guilt, the shame, but I could also see the defiance. She wasn't sorry. Not really. And that realization hit me harder than anything else. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to walk out, to leave her to deal with the mess she'd created. But I couldn't. Not yet. I had to think of Mason and Ava. They didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to have their lives ripped apart because of her selfish choices. I felt trapped, cornered, like I was drowning in a sea of betrayal and anger. I needed to figure out what came next. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. You've seen the lies, you've seen the betrayal, but you haven't seen the whole story yet. What will I uncover next? What new secret will change everything again? Tell me, do you think I'll find the strength to rebuild, or will I lose it all for good? Comment 1 if you believe in redemption. Comment 2 if you think the story takes an even darker turn. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The late nights, the secretive texts, the excuses, it all added up, and now, I had the proof staring me in the face. I'd seen the messages, read the words she tried to keep hidden, and each one felt like a punch to the gut. Isabel had been lying to me for months. And not just little white lies. These were lies that unraveled the life we'd built together. But even with the evidence in my hands, I still couldn't wrap my head around it. How had it come to this? How had the woman I'd spent over a decade building a life with chosen someone else over our family? I felt like a stranger in my own home. A man standing on a foundation that was crumbling beneath me. When I woke up the next morning, I knew I couldn't let it slide. Not anymore. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee mug, the steam rising in the early morning light. Isabel was upstairs getting ready for work. I could hear the hum of her hairdryer, the sound of her footsteps back and forth. The small, everyday noises that used to feel so normal. Now, they just made my stomach churn. Mason and Ava were still asleep. I couldn't drag them into this not yet. But I had to start figuring out how to protect them from the fallout. They were innocent in all of this, and I didn't want their lives shattered because of what Isabel had done. As I sat there, my mind raced. I needed to talk to someone, to figure out what steps to take next. I couldn't just sit back and hope things would work out. I needed a plan. That's when I called my lawyer, Gregory Marks. I'd met Gregory a few years back when we'd refinanced our mortgage. He was a straightforward guy, no nonsense, no sugarcoating. I knew he wasn't going to tell me what I wanted to hear, just to make me feel better. He was going to tell me what I needed to know. I dialed his number and waited, my fingers tapping nervously on the table. He answered on the second ring. "Cameron," he said, his voice calm and steady. "What's going on?" I hesitated for a moment, then let it all spill out: the late nights, the texts, the name Liam Bennett that had taken over our conversations, the message I'd found. As I spoke, I could hear Gregory scribbling notes, the sound of his pen scratching against paper. When I finished, there was a long pause. "All right," he finally said. "First things first. Don't do anything rash. If you're serious about taking this to court, we need to gather evidence. I'm talking dates, times, messages, anything that shows a pattern of behavior. The more documentation you have, the stronger your case will be." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I've got some texts," I said. "I can get more." "Good," Gregory said. "And we'll need to look at your finances. If she's been using marital funds on this guy, we can leverage that. But don't confront her again. Let me handle the legal side. You focus on keeping things stable for your kids." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a small flicker of hope. At least I had someone in my corner. Someone who could help me navigate the mess I was in. But even with Gregory's advice, I knew I needed more than just a legal strategy. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I needed to know who Liam Bennett really was. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. It felt strange, even a little wrong, to dig into someone's life like that. But at the same time, I had to protect my family. I had to know what kind of man had come into our lives and torn everything apart. A quick search online led me to Elliot Hayes, a private investigator based in town. He came highly recommended, discreet, thorough, and relentless. I called his office and explained the situation as carefully as I could. "You want me to find out if he's done this before?" Elliot asked. His voice was calm, almost casual, like he handled calls like mine every day. "Yes," I said. "I want to know if this is a pattern. If there are other women. If he's done this to other families." "All right," he said. "I'll start looking into it. I'll need any information you have: texts, emails, dates, places he's been with her. The more details, the faster I can get results." I sent Elliot what I had, and tried to keep my mind off what he might find. But it was impossible not to think about it. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a jolt of anxiety. I kept picturing Liam's face, his smug smile, the way he had inserted himself into our lives as if he belonged. I couldn't shake the image of Isabel laughing at his texts, the way she used to laugh with me. It felt like I was competing with a ghost, a man I'd never met but who was everywhere. And the worst part? I wasn't just losing Isabel. I was losing the life we'd built together, the home we'd made for our kids, the future I thought we had. It was all slipping away, piece by piece. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept my phone close, waiting for updates from Gregory or Elliot. Every time I saw Isabel, my chest tightened. She was still acting like everything was fine, like we were just going through a rough patch. But I knew better. I could see the distance in her eyes, the way she avoided meeting my gaze. I could feel the wall she'd put up between us. And no matter how much I wanted to break through it, I couldn't. She was already gone. But even with everything I'd learned, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The kids didn't know what was happening. Mason and Ava still saw us as their parents, their stability, their foundation. I couldn't let them down. I had to find a way to protect them, to keep their world from falling apart. As much as I wanted to confront Isabel again, I held back. Gregory's words echoed in my mind: "Don't do anything rash." It wasn't easy. Every time I saw her texting on her phone, every time she came home late without an explanation, I felt the anger bubbling up. I wanted to demand answers, to make her admit what she'd done. But I knew it wouldn't help. I had to be smarter than that. I had to play the long game. I had to think about what was best for Mason and Ava, even if it meant swallowing my pride and holding my tongue. And so I waited. I gathered the evidence. I worked with Gregory and Elliot, slowly building a case that would leave no room for doubt. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her take everything from me. I wasn't going to let her win. The days that followed felt like a waking nightmare. Every time I looked at Isabel, I couldn't stop the flood of questions that ran through my mind. How long had it been going on? Did she ever love me at all? Or had this been building up for years while I was too blind to see it? She went about her routines as though nothing had changed, but the distance between us was like a gaping chasm. I tried to keep things normal for Mason and Ava, but every morning felt heavier, every night longer. When I lay in bed, my thoughts would spiral. I'd stare at the ceiling, replaying the text I'd seen, the look on her face when I confronted her, the cold way she'd dismissed my pain as though it was an inconvenience. It was all I could do to keep it together around the kids. They didn't deserve to see me unravel. But inside, I was unraveling faster than I cared to admit. What made it worse was knowing that Liam Bennett was out there, probably laughing at me. I pictured him in his office, leaning back in his fancy chair, texting my wife without a care in the world. He must have thought he was untouchable, that I was some clueless husband who'd never stand up for himself. The thought of him filled me with a rage I could barely control. I wanted to confront him, to see the smug look on his face crumble when I called him out. But Gregory had been clear: keep a low profile. Gather evidence, don't make a scene. So I bottled it up, keeping my anger hidden as best I could, even though it felt like a ticking time bomb inside me. Meanwhile, Elliot had been making progress. Every few days, he'd send me an update, screenshots of Liam's social media posts, photos of him leaving expensive restaurants, receipts from luxury hotels that were conveniently charged to his company's expense account. The picture that emerged was clear: this wasn't just some guy who happened to fall for my wife. Liam Bennett was a serial manipulator, a man who used his position to get what he wanted. No matter who he hurt, he had done this before, to other families, to other men who trusted him. Knowing that only made it harder to keep my emotions in check. This wasn't just about me and Isabel anymore. This was about someone who had made a career out of destroying lives. I couldn't let him get away with it. One night, I was sitting in the living room, staring at my laptop screen, trying to figure out my next move. Mason came downstairs, rubbing his eyes. "Can't sleep, buddy?" I asked, setting the laptop aside. He nodded, climbing onto the couch next to me. "Dad," he said softly, "is something wrong?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "What makes you ask that?" He shrugged, looking down at his hands. "You and Mom, you don't talk like you used to. And she's always busy. It feels different." My chest tightened. He was only 12, but he could see it. I had tried so hard to shield him and Ava from the cracks in our family, but I couldn't hide it anymore. "Mason," I began carefully, "sometimes grown-ups go through hard times. It doesn't mean we don't love you and your sister. It just means we're trying to figure things out." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Is it because of Liam?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze. I hadn't told him anything. Hadn't even mentioned Liam's name around the kids. "How did he know? Where did you hear that?" I asked. "Mom talks about him a lot," Mason said. "She says he's her boss, but..." He trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. I felt a lump form in my throat. My 12-year-old son had noticed the man who was tearing our family apart before I did. "Mason," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "things aren't always what they seem. But I promise you, I'm going to make sure you and Ava are okay. No matter what." He nodded slowly, then leaned against me, resting his head on my shoulder. I put my arm around him, holding him close. At that moment, I made a silent vow. I would not let this destroy my kids. I would not let them feel like they were losing everything. If Isabel wanted to throw away our marriage, fine. But I wouldn't let her take Mason and Ava down with her. I sat there for a long time, holding my son, trying to ignore the storm that was still raging inside me. The next morning, I called Gregory again. "I need to move forward," I told him. I can't wait anymore. What's the next step? Gregory didn't hesitate. We start filing, he said. Divorce, custody, financial records, everything. We put it all on the table and let her know we're not backing down. Hearing those words gave me a strange sense of relief. I had spent weeks feeling powerless, but now I was finally taking control. I was finally doing something. It wouldn't be easy, far from it. I knew the road ahead would be messy and painful. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a direction. A purpose. I wasn't just sitting back and letting life happen to me. I was taking action. When I told Isabel about the divorce filing, she barely reacted. She just stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. So that's it, she said flatly. You're just giving up? I couldn't believe the audacity of her words. Giving up? She was the one who had given up on us long ago. You made your choice, I said, my voice cold. I'm just doing what I have to do. She rolled her eyes, as if I were the one being unreasonable, and walked out of the room. Her indifference stung more than I cared to admit. I had loved this woman. I had built a life with her. And now, it was like she couldn't care less. But I couldn't dwell on that. I had too much at stake. The kids needed stability, and I needed to make sure they got it. Over the next few days, I gathered every piece of evidence I could: texts, emails, financial statements. Gregory and Elliot worked tirelessly, putting together a case that would show the court exactly who Isabel had become and why I needed full custody of Mason and Ava. It was exhausting, draining in every sense of the word. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My kids were counting on me. At night, after everyone else was asleep, I would sit in the kitchen, staring at the stack of documents in front of me. Each piece of paper told a story of lies, of betrayal, of a family that had been ripped apart. And as painful as it was to relive it all, I knew it was necessary. I had to face it head on if I wanted to come out on the other side. Through it all, one thing kept me going. The thought of Mason and Ava smiling again, feeling safe and loved, knowing that no matter what, their dad was there for them. That was the light at the end of this long, dark tunnel. And I would do whatever it took to reach it. The tension in the house was suffocating. Every day felt like walking a tightrope. The air heavy with unspoken accusations and icy stares. Isabel and I barely exchanged words now. She came home later and later, slipping through the front door with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Sometimes she'd greet the kids, sometimes not. I noticed the way Mason had started shutting himself in his room right after dinner. The way Ava clung to me more than ever. The kids felt it. They didn't understand exactly what was going on, but they knew something was wrong. And every time Isabel pulled out her phone, laughing quietly at some message she wouldn't share, I had to grit my teeth and remind myself to stay calm. I couldn't blow up in front of the kids. I couldn't let them see me unravel. It didn't stop the anger from boiling under the surface. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Isabel's faint movements on the other side of the house. Sometimes she'd come to bed, slipping under the covers without a word. Other nights, she wouldn't. I stopped asking questions. The answers would only make it worse. Instead, I focused on the plan. I kept a notebook hidden in the back of my closet, filled with dates, times, and notes from conversations I'd overheard or caught in passing. Gregory had told me to document everything, and I took that advice to heart. Every text I found, every unexplained absence, it all went in the notebook. I didn't know exactly when I'd need it, but I knew that day would come. And when it did, I'd be ready. But the evidence wasn't enough. I needed to understand why. I needed to know how a man like Liam Bennett had worked his way into my wife's life, into my family's life. Elliot Hayes was already digging into Liam's past, sending me periodic updates that painted a picture I didn't want to see. Liam wasn't just some charming boss. He was a predator, a man who thrived on the attention and admiration of vulnerable women. He had a history of entangling himself with married coworkers, slowly breaking down their boundaries until they were dependent on him. Once he had what he wanted, he moved on to the next. And yet, even knowing all of this, Isabel had let him in. She'd let him cross every line. I felt like I was fighting a ghost, a man I'd never met but who had taken over my life. I didn't just want answers, I wanted him to pay for what he'd done. The kids kept me grounded. No matter how angry or hurt I felt, Mason and Ava were my focus. I kept their routines as normal as possible: breakfast before school, helping with homework in the evenings, tucking them in at night. But even in those small, quiet moments, the cracks were there. Mason was becoming more withdrawn, his once endless questions now replaced with silence. He'd sit at the table, staring down at his plate, barely speaking. Ava would watch him, her big eyes full of worry she didn't know how to express. It broke my heart. I hated seeing them like this, and I hated Isabel even more for what she was putting them through. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the stack of documents Elliot had sent me. My laptop screen glowed in the dim light, the photos and messages a grim reminder of just how far things had spiraled out of control. I should have gone to bed, but I couldn't. Every time I tried, the images would flood back: the texts I'd seen, the receipts for hotel rooms, the pictures of Liam's smug face. I wanted to hit something, to scream, but instead, I just sat there, my hands clenched into fists, the quiet of the house pressing down on me like a weight. I thought about Gregory's advice. Be patient, he'd said. Build your case. Don't do anything impulsive. I knew he was right. But patience wasn't easy when you felt like you were watching your life fall apart in slow motion. I wanted to storm into Liam's office, drag him out in front of everyone, and make him answer for what he'd done. I wanted to confront Isabel again, to force her to admit the truth. But I knew better. The court wouldn't care about my anger. They'd care about evidence, about stability, about what was best for Mason and Ava. So I stayed calm, at least on the outside. I kept my voice steady, my tone neutral. I played the part of the composed, responsible father. And all the while, I waited. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Every day, I expected something to happen: a new piece of evidence from Elliot, a call from Gregory, a confrontation with Isabel. But the days dragged on, each one blurring into the next. Isabel continued her routine of late nights and vague excuses. Liam's name hung in the air like a bad smell, unspoken but always present. And I kept adding to the notebook, each entry another nail in the coffin of our marriage. When the call finally came, it wasn't what I expected. It was Elliot, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. Cameron, he said, we've got something new. You're going to want to see this. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. What is it? Financial records, he said. Liam's been using company funds for personal expenses. We've got receipts for gifts, hotel stays, dinners, all of it. My grip on the phone tightened. You're sure? Absolutely, Elliot said. And here's the kicker, some of the expenses have Isabel's name on them. Looks like she's been enjoying the perks of his embezzlement. My stomach dropped. I'd suspected it, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. What does that mean for custody? I asked. Elliot hesitated. It strengthens your case. If she's tied up in his financial mess, it makes her look irresponsible, untrustworthy. Judges don't like that. I nodded, the anger bubbling up again. Send me everything you have, I said. I'll forward it to Gregory. We need to move on this. After the call, I sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. This was the leverage I needed. Isabel had made her choice, and now, she was going to face the consequences. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for Mason and Ava, for their future. They deserved better than this, and I was going to make damn sure they got it. With Elliot's latest update, the stakes felt higher than ever. I spent the better part of a day combing through the evidence he'd sent. Every invoice, every receipt, every smug, self-satisfied email from Liam was another crack in the story Isabel had been trying to spin. I forwarded everything to Gregory, and his reply came back almost immediately. We've got them. Let's schedule a meeting. I felt a flicker of hope, something I hadn't felt in weeks. Finally, it seemed like we were gaining the upper hand. But that hope didn't last long. With each step forward, the reality of what lay ahead loomed larger. This wasn't just about Liam. This was about Isabel, about my kids, about tearing apart the life I thought I knew and somehow rebuilding from the wreckage. I didn't tell the kids about any of it. Mason and Ava deserved a little more time in the dark, before the truth came crashing down. Mason had become more withdrawn, more guarded. I caught him more than once staring out the window, his face tight with an expression I couldn't read. Ava, on the other hand, clung to me every chance she got. "Daddy," she asked one night, "are we okay?" Her voice was small, hesitant, like she already knew the answer might not be what she wanted to hear. I knelt down beside her bed and kissed her forehead. "We're okay," I said. "No matter what, I promise we'll be okay." The words felt like both a promise and a plea, but I'd do whatever it took to make them true. Isabel, as usual, was nowhere to be found. It was nearly midnight before she came home, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I was still awake, sitting in the dimly lit living room, waiting. She didn't even look at me as she passed. "You're late," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. She paused in the hallway, not turning around. "You knew I'd be," she said simply, and then she disappeared into the bedroom. No explanation. No apology. Just more of the same detached indifference that had been driving me crazy. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but Gregory's voice rang in my head, "Don't do anything rash." And so I stayed in my seat, staring at the empty hallway, my jaw tight, my fists clenched. The next morning, Gregory's office was all business. He had everything laid out: papers, timelines, arguments that connected the dots in a way that couldn't be ignored. As we went through the evidence, I felt a strange mixture of anger and relief. Anger that it had come to this, relief that at least we had a fighting chance. "This is solid," Gregory said, tapping a folder with his pen. "No judge is going to look at this and think she's putting the kids first." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. "What's next?" I asked. Gregory leaned back in his chair. "We'll file for an emergency custody hearing. It's a strong move, but with what we have, I think it's worth it." I exhaled, my chest tightening. "Do it," I said. "The sooner, the better." Driving home, my mind raced. The image of Liam's face, arrogant, self-assured, untouchable, flashed through my head. I thought about all the times Isabel had laughed at his texts, all the times she'd lied to my face, all the nights she'd spent with him while I was home with the kids. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. No more waiting. No more giving her the benefit of the doubt. I had to protect my kids. I had to protect myself. That's all there was to it. When I got home, Mason was waiting in the driveway. He had a basketball under his arm, and when he saw me, he hesitated, like he wasn't sure if he should say something. "What's up, buddy?" I asked, stepping out of the car. He shrugged, looking down at the ground. "Nothing." But his face said otherwise. "You sure?" I pressed. He glanced up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and confusion. "Why is Mom always talking about Liam?" he finally asked. My stomach twisted. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Mason," I began carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups." "No," he cut me off, his voice rising. "I want to know. Is she leaving? Is he going to live here or something?" I was stunned. I didn't know how to answer. "No," I said firmly. "He's not coming here, and we're not letting him change what we have." Mason looked at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he turned and walked into the house without another word. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about his question. Why is Mom always talking about Liam? The fact that Mason had picked up on it said more than I wanted to admit. It meant Isabel hadn't just been cheating on me, she'd been cheating on all of us. She'd let that man into our lives, even if it was only through her words and actions. And now Mason and Ava were paying the price. It was unforgivable. And it made me more determined than ever to get them away from her influence. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the preparation for the custody hearing. Gregory and Elliot were relentless, building a case that left no room for doubt. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but I knew it was necessary. I knew it was the only way to protect Mason and Ava. I'd do anything to shield them from the fallout, to keep them from feeling the full weight of Isabel's betrayal. When the day of the hearing finally came, I felt ready, angry, anxious, and ready. As I stood outside the courtroom, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Gregory was beside me, his calm presence a reminder that I wasn't in this alone. "You've got this," he said quietly. "Stick to the facts, keep your emotions in check, and let the evidence speak for itself." I nodded, clenching and unclenching my fists. Isabel was already inside, sitting with her attorney. When I walked in, I didn't look at her. I couldn't. I focused on my kids, on what this fight was really about. I wasn't doing this to hurt her. I was doing it to protect them. That thought kept me grounded as we presented our case, as Gregory laid out the evidence, as the judge listened intently. This was it. My chance to take back control, to make sure Mason and Ava had the stability they deserved. And I wouldn't stop fighting until they did. The courtroom was heavy with tension, as we all sat waiting for the judge's decision. The air felt too thick to breathe, and the muffled sounds of the hallway outside only made the silence inside seem louder. I glanced at Isabel sitting across the aisle, her posture rigid, her face set in a mask of calm that I knew had to be fake. She looked over once, just briefly, and for a moment our eyes met. There was no apology there, no regret, just defiance. It was the same look she'd given me so many times over the last few months, and it only fueled the slow burn of anger that I had been fighting to keep in check. I turned away before I could do something stupid, my hands gripping the edge of the table in front of me so hard I thought I might break the wood. My lawyer, Gregory, gave me a quick glance, his expression steady and calm. "It's going to be fine," he whispered, barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. The judge came back in, his expression as unreadable as ever, and the room stood for him before he gestured for us to sit. My heart was pounding so loud in my ears that I could hardly hear his words. He began with the formalities, summarizing the case, mentioning the evidence, the testimonies. But I didn't care about the buildup. I was waiting for one thing, the decision. Then, finally, it came. The words hit me like a hammer. Primary custody is awarded to Mr. Reed. I had braced myself for the possibility of a loss, for some loophole Isabel's lawyer might have exploited, some way the judge might have been swayed. But hearing those words, knowing that the court saw through all of her lies, it was a moment I'll never forget. Relief crashed over me like a wave, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Gregory put a hand on my shoulder, a subtle gesture of victory. But I kept my eyes forward, not daring to look at Isabel. I knew if I saw her face, if I saw the anger or the tears, I might lose the composure I had fought so hard to maintain. After the hearing ended, the hallway outside was a flurry of activity. Lawyers chatting, clerks walking briskly, people whispering as they passed. I stayed by Gregory's side as he went over the next steps. "We'll get the paperwork finalized. She'll have visitation, but only under strict guidelines. You did it, Cameron. This is what we needed." His voice was steady, professional, but I could tell he was pleased. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about the kids, about how Mason would react when I told him, about how Ava would smile, that little smile of hers, when she found out she wasn't going to have to leave the house every weekend. I couldn't wait to see their faces, to tell them that they were staying with me, that things were going to get better. Isabel brushed past us as we talked, her attorney following close behind. She didn't say a word, but I caught the briefest flash of her face as she passed. Her jaw was tight, her eyes red. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a pang of something close to pity. She had lost, and no matter what she'd done, that had to hurt. But then I thought of all the nights she'd stayed out late, of all the times she'd laughed at Liam's texts while I sat alone, of how she had shattered the trust we'd built over years. That pity disappeared as quickly as it had come. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight of the last few months starting to lift. The sky was gray, the air cool, but for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel oppressive. I drove home in silence, no music, no distractions, just the hum of the road and my thoughts. I thought about Mason and Ava, about how I'd tell them the news. I thought about the next steps, about making sure their routine stayed as normal as possible. Most of all, I thought about what this victory meant. It wasn't just about winning custody. It was about taking back control of my life, about showing Isabel and Liam that they couldn't destroy me. When I walked through the front door, Mason was sitting at the kitchen table, a book open in front of him. He looked up when he heard me, and I saw the question in his eyes before he even spoke. "Well?" he asked, his voice cautious, hesitant. I set my keys on the counter and walked over to him. "It's done," I said. "You and Ava are staying here with me." For a moment, he just stared at me, and then I saw the faintest hint of relief. He nodded, once, and went back to his book. That was Mason's way. He wasn't one to show a lot of emotion, but I could tell he was glad. And that was enough for me. Ava came bounding down the stairs a few minutes later, her energy as boundless as ever. "Daddy," she called, throwing her arms around my waist. I picked her up, holding her close. "What's going on?" she asked. I smiled at her. "You're staying here with me," I said. "You're not going anywhere." She looked at me with wide eyes, her smile growing even bigger. "Really?" she asked. I nodded. "Really?" She hugged me tighter, and I felt a knot in my chest loosen just a little. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat in the living room, the house quiet around me. The victory was fresh, the relief still sinking in. But I knew this wasn't over. Isabel would still be in their lives, still have her visits, still be a presence. I'd have to navigate. And Liam, he wasn't done yet. I could feel it. He hadn't gone through everything we'd unearthed without a fight. I didn't know what he'd do next, but I knew one thing. I had to be ready. The battle in court was over, but the fight wasn't. Not yet. It didn't take long for word of the custody ruling to get around. I kept my focus on the kids and their routine, but the whispers at Mason's school, the sideways glances from neighbors, even the "how are you holding up" texts from old friends, they all piled on faster than I could sort through them. I tried not to let it get under my skin. The last thing I wanted was for Mason or Ava to see me stressed out. They had been through enough already. Isabel had visitation once a week, under strict supervision. The first time she showed up, she didn't make eye contact. She barely spoke, just nodded at the social worker and spent most of the visit playing with Ava, who didn't seem to notice how forced everything was. Mason, on the other hand, sat at the edge of the room with his arms crossed, staring at the floor. I kept an eye on them from a distance, pretending to scroll through my phone while the whole scene played out. Seeing her like that, awkward, unsure, was a far cry from the confident, defiant woman I had faced in court. I wasn't sure if it was guilt, or just exhaustion catching up to her, but part of me couldn't help but wonder if she was finally beginning to understand what she had done. Not just to me, but to Mason and Ava. After the visit, Mason barely said a word. I asked him if he wanted to talk, but he just shook his head. I didn't push. He'd open up when he was ready. In the meantime, I did what I could to keep things steady. I made dinner, helped Ava with her homework, tried to find moments of normalcy in what still felt like a storm. At night, I sat in the living room after the kids went to bed, the silence of the house pressing in. I kept replaying the past few months in my head, the lies, the fights, the courtroom. I knew I should feel victorious. I'd won, after all. The judge had ruled in my favor, and the kids were with me. But the truth was, the weight of it all still hung over me. It wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about piecing our lives back together. And that, I knew, was going to take time. Isabel's visits didn't get any easier. The kids seemed to take turns shutting down. One week it was Ava, clinging to me after Isabel left, asking me why her mom couldn't stay longer. The next week it was Mason, snapping at her for something small, then storming off before she could respond. I tried to shield them from it as much as I could, but there were only so many questions I could answer without getting into the mess of everything. "Your mom loves you," I told them both, more times than I could count. "She just made some bad decisions." I hated how hollow it sounded. I wanted to tell them the truth, to explain what she'd done, why things had fallen apart. But every time I thought about it, I saw their faces so young, so full of questions, and I stopped myself. They deserved the truth, but they also deserved to hold on to whatever innocence they had left. The hardest part was when Isabel and I had to speak directly. It didn't happen often, but every now and then, something would come up, a scheduling conflict, a question about the kids' school, a request for an extra visit. I kept my responses short, to the point. "I'll check their schedule and let you know. I'll talk to the kids and get back to you." I never engaged more than I had to. I couldn't. It wasn't about being petty or holding a grudge. It was about protecting myself. Every conversation with her felt like stepping into quicksand, and I knew if I wasn't careful, I'd get sucked right back into the cycle of blame and excuses. One night, after a particularly rough exchange over the phone, I sat at the kitchen table staring at a half-empty cup of coffee. My head was pounding, and the house was quiet, too quiet. The kids were asleep, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old photos, pictures of family trips, birthdays, lazy weekends. There was one of Isabel and me on our anniversary, smiling at each other like we had it all figured out. I stared at it for a long time, before finally putting the phone down. It was hard not to think about the good times. To remember the woman I had married instead of the one I had just fought against in court. But those memories felt like they belonged to another life. And maybe they did. In the weeks that followed, I started to notice small changes. Mason began talking more, little by little. Not about Isabel, he still avoided that topic, but about his day, his friends, his classes. I saw him laugh at something Ava said during dinner, a sound I hadn't heard in months. Ava, too, seemed a bit lighter. She started drawing more, leaving her little sketches all over the house. It wasn't much, but it was something. And I clung to those small moments, knowing they were signs that we were moving forward, however slowly. Through it all, I kept my distance from Isabel. I kept my focus on the kids, on making sure they felt safe and loved. There were times I caught myself wondering how she was handling everything, whether she was doing okay. I didn't dwell on it for long. I had to remind myself that her well-being wasn't my responsibility anymore. She had made her choices, and I was still dealing with the fallout. I couldn't afford to spend energy worrying about her. Instead, I put that energy into rebuilding what we had lost. I took the kids out for weekend hikes, signed Mason up for a basketball league, helped Ava set up a small garden in the backyard. It wasn't easy. There were still tough days. Days when the kids asked questions I didn't have answers to. Days when the weight of everything felt like too much. But slowly, we were finding our rhythm again. The house started to feel like home. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could see a path forward. Life has a strange way of leveling out when you least expect it. I wouldn't say things went back to normal. Normal was a word that didn't seem to fit anymore. But there was a kind of rhythm that returned. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and before long, the chaos that had dominated my life started to feel more like background noise. It didn't disappear entirely, but it softened, blending into the hum of daily routines. The quiet moments with Mason and Ava, the steady, unremarkable hours that came and went without incident. And that was a gift, in its own way. Mason took up basketball with a new kind of determination. I drove him to practices and sat on the bleachers, watching as he found his stride on the court. He was taller now, his movements more confident, his focus sharper than I'd seen in years. It wasn't just the game, though. It was what the game gave him, a sense of control, a way to channel the frustration and uncertainty that had hung over him since the split. He rarely mentioned Isabel, but I could tell he was working through it in his own way, one shot, one layup at a time. Ava, on the other hand, poured herself into her art. The house became a gallery of her creations, watercolors taped to the fridge, charcoal sketches framed in cheap wooden borders, abstract swirls of color that she'd proudly display on the living room walls. She asked me once if I thought her drawings were any good, and when I said they were beautiful, she smiled so big it nearly broke my heart. It wasn't about the art itself. It was about her finding something that was hers, something that brought her joy. She was healing, piece by piece, with every pencil stroke and brush flick. Meanwhile, the first settled into a new normal of my own. Work became a refuge in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't that I threw myself into it to escape, more that it gave me a structure. A place where the drama of my personal life couldn't reach me. I didn't talk about Isabel at the office. I didn't bring up the custody battles, or the endless tension that had defined the last year. I just did my job, quietly, steadily, and found a kind of solace in the routine. When I left at the end of the day, I knew I was coming home to Mason and Ava, to a house that was finally starting to feel stable again. Isabel still had her visitation days, and they were what they were. Supervised, brief, and often strained. She tried, I'll give her that. She'd bring small gifts, ask them questions about school and their hobbies. But there was always a distance. The kids were polite, even kind at times, but they weren't the same with her. Not anymore. Ava would hug her, but it was a quick hug. The kind that said I'll see you later rather than I've missed you. Mason stayed guarded, answering her questions with a few words and rarely looking up from his phone. I could see the pain in Isabel's face when she left. But I didn't step in to soften it. That wasn't my job anymore. And then there was Liam. I hadn't seen or heard from him directly since the custody ruling, but his name still came up from time to time. A neighbor mentioned seeing him at a grocery store across town. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that he'd lost his job, that his reputation had taken a major hit. I didn't ask for details, didn't dig. I didn't need to. What I knew was enough: he was out of our lives, and he wasn't coming back. But even with him gone, his presence lingered like a shadow. It was in the small things, the hesitation in Mason's voice when he talked about friends' dads. The way Ava's smile sometimes faded when she saw a family together at the park. They were doing better, yes, but scars don't heal overnight. I knew that. I reminded myself of it every day, telling myself that time would smooth out the rough edges, that we just had to keep moving forward. And we did. Slowly, steadily, we moved forward. The laughter came back in small doses. The arguments about homework and bedtime started to feel like the old, familiar kind of arguments. Not the heavy, loaded ones. I could tell Mason was starting to trust me again. Starting to see me not as the dad who fought with mom, but just as dad. Ava's giggles filled the house more often, her bright energy spilling over into everything she did. The house wasn't quiet and tense anymore. It was alive. One evening, after dinner, Mason and I went for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. He didn't say much at first, just kicked at leaves on the sidewalk as we walked side by side. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Do you think Mom will ever come back here?" I stopped, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged, looking down at his sneakers. "I don't know. Like, do you think she'll ever move back in?" I could see the confusion in his eyes, the mix of hope and anger and sadness that he hadn't quite figured out how to handle. "No," I said gently. "She's not coming back. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Yeah. I guess." He didn't say anything else after that, but I could tell he was processing it, turning it over in his head. I let him have that space. When we got home, Ava was on the floor in the living room, coloring. She looked up when we walked in and waved her crayons in the air. "Look," she said. "I made a picture of us." She held up a drawing of a stick figure family, her, Mason, and me. No one else. I felt a pang in my chest but forced a smile. "That's great, sweetheart," I said, crouching down to look closer. She beamed, her face lighting up with pride. "It's us. Our family," she said. Mason walked over and glanced at the drawing. He didn't say anything, just nodded, and sat down beside her. It was a simple moment, but it meant everything. It was the three of us, together. Stronger than we had been before. The weeks turned into months, and those months stretched into something resembling peace. I stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. I stopped looking over my shoulder. The drama that had defined the past year faded into memory. Still there, but no longer a constant presence. Life went on. The kids grew taller, the house got quieter. I found myself smiling more, laughing more, and while I still carried the weight of everything that had happened, it didn't feel so heavy anymore. One night, as I sat in the living room with Mason and Ava, a movie playing in the background, I looked around at them, at the small, comfortable chaos of our life. Ava was curled up on the couch, Mason was sprawled in the recliner, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something close to peace. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was ours. We had weathered the storm, and we had come out on the other side. Together. So, now you know everything. The betrayal. The heartbreak. The battle I never asked for. But what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have walked away? Fought back harder? The choice I made has left ripples I never imagined. Share your thoughts below. How would you have handled it? And don't forget, the next chapter of my journey might surprise you even more. Through everything I endured, I learned one critical lesson. Honesty and accountability matter. In our society, trust is the foundation of family, work, and community. When that trust is broken, it's our responsibility to address it, not just for ourselves, but for those who depend on us. By confronting deceit, by choosing integrity over convenience, we can build stronger, more resilient relationships, ones that stand the test of time and hardship. This is the legacy we must strive for, not only for our families, but for every community across the United States.